Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started because we have a lot to cover this evening. First of all, thanks everyone for being here. I very much appreciate it. Thanks for being board members. Um, I know it's a lot of work. I always say it's the equivalent to no good deed goes unpunished. Um, it is very rewarding, but it can be a lot of work. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, here we are. Trustee Training 102. So tonight we are going to talk about some things we didn't talk about last week. Last week we went over the basics of uh, duties, authorities, responsibilities, kind of the whole basics of, what a board member is supposed to do. Today we're going to go in a little bit deeper on some of the activities that you are responsible for. First of all, here's our contact information, both mine and Shirley, and you can see that I did add Shirley's phone number this time. So again, please don't hesitate to contact either one of us if you have any questions. We are more than welcome to help you. Also, you'll see at the bottom, it says, please don't forget to fill out the survey. When you receive the email back from us after this session, part of it will be a link to a survey that we request that you fill out. It's very helpful to us for you to let us know how we're doing. Did you like this webinar? Do you wish it contained information it doesn't? Is there something we could do better? Are there other webinars you would like to have on different topics? And let us know. Unfortunately, I can't do anything about the actual subject matter. I tell people I just report it. I don't create the law. But if there's something different that you'd like us to produce or present, please let us know. The disclaimer here is just because we are going to be talking about some legal information, and you just have to know that I have a law degree, but I cannot be your attorney. Hopefully your library has an attorney. I cannot stress this enough. Every library should have an attorney, and I don't mean the municipal attorney. You should have an attorney that's specifically qualified or works in library law, which is kind of a subset of municipal law, but a very specific subset. So if you do not have one, I do keep a list of attorneys in Michigan who practice this area of the law, and I'm happy to share that list. So tonight we're going to be talking about, last time, if you remember, we did read. This time it's go with the flow. So we're going to be talking about funding, finances, and money. We're going to be talking about the librarian director or board member relationship. And we're going to be talking about open, transparent records and actions. If we have time, we are going to delve a little bit into intellectual freedom, but that's a whole other kind of presentation. So we'll see what happens at the end if we have time. So first of all, we're going to talk a little bit about funding and finances. So as we talked about last week, money is one of the trustees' primary responsibilities, is your fiduciary duty, the funding and the financial health of your library. That's one of your main priorities. So it can help for you to understand in Michigan, how do public libraries get their money? How are public libraries funded? Well, public libraries are funded by local support, penal fines, state aid, some other programs like grant programs, and of course, fundraising. When we talk about local support, most often you will hear that phrase with relation to the State Aid to Libraries Act. In order to receive state aid, so what is state aid? So state aid is the amount of money that's allocated every year from the legislature and actually given or allocated to the Library of Michigan, and then we distribute that state aid to libraries on a per capita basis. Now, in order to receive that money, a public library has to conform with certain requirements. We're going to get more into that in a little bit, but that's kind of the basis. One of the things they talk about in the state aid is a certain amount of local support. So local support means, how much money does your direct community give you? In Michigan, public libraries are established by municipalities. They are expected to be funded by the municipality. They are governed by the municipality. So Local support would be things like your millage, depending on your library establishment type. Again, like we talked about last week, there are about right now 10, 11 types of public libraries that are established under 6 different laws. All of those different public libraries and laws, there are a total limit of between 1 and 4 mills that are the kind of cap for funding. So some libraries have a maximum of 1 mill they can put on the ballot. Some libraries have a maximum of 4. What you have depends on your library type. For example, if you are a city library under PA 164 under section 1, so in other words, you are a city library established via a charter section, an ordinance section, a resolution, you have a 5, 7, or 9 member appointed board. This particular library type is permitted to have 1 mill voted, and then you are permitted to have 1 mill unvoted. So your city can levy 1 mill without a vote, and then you can put 1 mill on the ballot for a total of 2 mills. If you are a district library, you have the ability to levy up to 4 mills or put 4 mills on the ballot. If you are a county library, you also traditionally have had that ability for your county to levy a mill without a vote. However, most counties don't do that. That's kind of fallen out of favor. Most counties will put it on the ballot. Your other option for local support would be appropriation. So this would be funding from your municipality that is not on the ballot. It's not a millage. So it's taken out of your municipality's and levying that they do for their operational millage and allocated to you. And which you have, again, depending on your establishment type, if you're a township library or a city library or a village library, under PA 164, you would have had to have a millage to start with in order to have been established. Some libraries establish, they have their millage, and then over the years, they kind of let the millage drop and their municipalities fund them through appropriations. If you're a district library, you may be funded with a millage or you may be funded by appropriations. Some are a mixture of the two. So essentially, the bulk of your money is most likely from either a millage or an appropriation, depending on your situation. Shirley, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
No, that's all correct. Thank you very much. Most of them are millages, especially district libraries. But it's rare for the appropriations, but they are out there. But thank you.
Yeah, millages are the most stable form of funding for sure. Then your other option are penal fines. Now, you may have all heard a lot about penal fines. So penal fines are in the Michigan Constitution. We're the only state where penal fines have been allotted to libraries within the Constitution. It is considered local support because penal fines are actually monies from the county courts that are allocated to the counties and then distributed by the counties to public libraries on a per capita basis. So the way that it works is that every year, the Library of Michigan sends a list to each county treasurer that lists the libraries in their county that are eligible for penal fines and the population numbers that those libraries serve. So every library has a legal service area, so that would be the community you serve based on your establishment. A city library, you're going to serve the city. A township library, you're going to serve the township. A district library, you're going to serve those municipalities that formed the district. And then you may have a contracted area population, and your contracted area population would be those populations your library serves based on contracts for service that the board has negotiated with different municipalities. So your legal service area plus your contracted service area equals the total number of people that your library serves. So that is the number that the Library of Michigan sends to the county treasurers, along with your library's name, to say this library is eligible to receive penal fines. What happens then is that the county treasurer receives the penal fines. Now, some counties receive them annually, some receive them more often, quarterly. The court takes all of the fines that have been levied on defendants for crimes. So for anything, any action that they've been accused of or convicted of, a statute in the Michigan Penal Code, which is a criminal code, the criminal laws. And any of those laws, so obviously it would be things like drug offenses. You just think of the misdemeanors, think of the panoply of crimes that you could have. In addition to that, traffic fines are considered part of penal fines, because at first, when the Constitution was written in the 1800s and so on, traffic fines were considered originally criminal fines. And then when the traffic fines were pulled into civil fines, the legislature continued to allocate them to public libraries. So anytime you have a speeding ticket and the ticket is written on the state code, so most often a state trooper pulls you over and writes you a ticket based on the state motor vehicle code, as opposed to your municipality. So if I get pulled over here in Meridian Township, most often the townships or your cities have a separate vehicle code of their own, a traffic code of their own, that's an ordinance, and they will cite you based on that ordinance. If that happens, then the amount of money that you're feed by the court will go to your municipality and not libraries. So the ticket has to be written on the state statute based on your local municipal code. So every year, or the time, can be monthly, quarterly, the court will send the money from those penal fines over to the county treasurer. The county treasurer takes that amount of penal fines, divides that amount by the population of the county, and then arrives at a per capita amount. Then takes that per capita and multiplies it by the amount of population each library serves. So then the resulting number is the amount of money that you will get from the penal fine. So if you have, if the per capita ends up being $1 and you have 100 people, then you get $100 in penal fines. So that is how, the penal fines are calculated. If there is a municipality in your county that has no library service, doesn't have a library, does not have a service contract with any library for service, then penal fines are still allocated for that population. But what happens is the penal fines are placed in an escrow account at the county, and the money sits there and earns interest until the municipality either establishes their own library or contracts with an existing library to provide their people with service. It's very important that you as trustees are the entities that are able to contract with these other municipalities to give them service, municipalities that don't have a library or don't have library service. It's very important that in conjunction with your director, that any contract you sign, any contract you form with another library to provide service gets to us at the Library of Michigan. Because if it doesn't, we won't be able to adjust your population and who you serve, and you won't receive penal fines and state aid for that particular group of people. So it's very important that the numbers remain current. Also, if you terminate a contract with a municipality that you no longer wish to serve, if you don't let us know, and then we pay you penal fines and state aid for that population, you'll end up having to pay it back. So it's important that you work with your director and make sure that all of the numbers and their populations are correct, and that all that's been filed at the Library of Michigan. In order to receive penal fines, there are two requirements. Your library has to be legally established. That means that your library has to have been created under the applicable law and has to have been done properly. And two, that your library has to be open to the public 10 hours a week. If you meet those two criteria, then you are able to receive penal fines as a library. Penal fines are usually handed out. What happens is by statute, the Library of Michigan has to get all of the information to the county treasurers in July. And then usually the penal fines are paid out either end of July or beginning of August. However, one of the things to know is that June 30th of every year is the date that the Library of Michigan uses as the cutoff date for your populations of who's going to receive penal fines that year. So when you're looking at contracts, you want to make sure that you don't have a contract that ends after June 30th. And the problem with that is if you do, then what we look at when we're assigning populations and we're saying, okay, this is who this library served, this is who this library served. You don't want to end your contract before June 30th. Because Shirley's laughing. Yeah, I made that mistake. Because if you do, what happens is we look at June 30th and we say, okay, who is serving what population on June 30th? If that population is not part of your service area on June 30th, then you will not receive the penal fines for the prior year for that service, for that population. So if you have a municipality that you've been serving all year, but maybe you have a fiscal year. There's 9 different fiscal years in the state, okay, that different entities, libraries use. If you have a fiscal year that ends prior to June, you may say, we're going to have our contracts go with the fiscal year. And if you terminate a contract, then you're going to be stuck and we're not going to give you the penal fines for that population for the prior year when you did serve them. So it's important, if you have any question, contact us and we can confirm with you that you're set and that your contracts are okay. And then when you're negotiating contracts, just make sure that you don't end them prior to June 30th, your termination dates for those contracts. And the directors are pretty up on this too, and they can also help you out with that. As we said, penal fines are calculated on a per capita basis. You can only spend penal fines on library purposes. Your municipality, a lot of times the municipalities think that these are municipal funds. They are not. These are county funds that are allocated to the municipalities, but the only thing they can be used for is library service. Your county may not touch, your municipality may not touch your penal fines for anything. They can only be used for library service. Now, you may see the Library of Michigan keeps a chart on our penal fines page that lists all the per capitas for a particular year across the state. So you may look at your county and say, okay, our per capita is $1, but how come this other per capita is $20 a person? And that can vary a lot because of different factors. Because this is all based on the caseloads of the county court, there are some areas of the state, because they have a truck weigh station, because they're on a highway that, they're near the border crossings. There's different areas of the state that just have some more activity with regards to caseloads in courts than other parts of the state. And so if the court generates more money in fines, then that area is going to have higher penal fines than another area. So there is quite a bit of fluctuation in penal fines. So, if it can fluctuate because of law changes. When marijuana was made legal, penal fines went way down in some areas that were used to having a lot of, drug convictions. If the state troopers in your area, if there's not a big presence of state troopers or state police, then your penal fines may not be as high as you want because there isn't the same amount of enforcement as there may be in another area. So there are lots of different factors that can contribute to how big your penal fines are. Penal fines have never been meant to be the primary funding source for public libraries or for public library service. So when you are creating a contract or when you're looking at your budget, penal fines are meant to be a component. They're not meant to be your whole budget or the majority of your budget. So when you're contracting with other municipalities for service, having a contract for only penal fines and state aid is a big mistake, because if you're in a municipality where you have a millage and your legal service area is paying $100 a year on that millage, and then you contract with a neighboring township and you say just penal fines and state aid, remember your legal service area also gets penal fines and state aid, plus they're paying a millage. So now you have a situation where your legal service area is paying more for the same service than that township is, which means your legal service area is subsidizing the service for that township. The members of your community are paying not only for their own library service, but for the library service of this other township. Most of the time, when people see that, they're not very happy. They're not very happy to see, geez, I pay $100 a year in a millage, and my neighbor in the township next door comes to this library and they pay nothing. It's just penal fines and state aid. The taxpayers pay nothing. So we strongly encourage that review contracts you already have. If they are for penal fines and state aid alone, look at renegotiating for an amount of money that is comparable to what your legal service area is paying for the same service, right? You wouldn't want to go to Target and you buy a t-shirt for $20 and then the person behind you gets the exact same t-shirt for $10, right? That wouldn't make you very happy. So this is a really important, because of your fiduciary duty, it's really important that you act in the best interest of the library, which means receiving adequate compensation for services rendered, right? The law requires that public entities can't give anything away. You have to get fair market value for whatever services you provide. Shirley, is there anything that you would like to add to this penal fines?
Well, we were always, years ago, when we were trustees, for me, a lot of years ago, we were told not, when we did our annual budget, not to use penal fines as part of the budget. It was called the frosting on the cake, because there's such a variance from year to year in penal fines. One year it could be 5,000, another year it could be 7,000. There's a lot of variables when it comes to penal fines. So that should not be a definite source of your funding for a given year. And Claire is right. There's just so many variables when it comes to penal fines. When you get them, most of the counties or the municipalities get them once a year. There are some, I know there's a couple in the UP that get them every month. They went to court and they wanted their money every month and they do it. There's some that get it quarterly, but that is just because they felt they needed that income. But no, it is, like I said, it's the frosting on the cake. We are the only county, I mean, the only state in the nation that has it. You'd be surprised when I would go to ALA, how many people would come up and say to me, how do we get penal fines? You're the only one that gets penal fines. And it has been a note of contention in some of the neighboring states and how we've always been able to get it and they never do. But anyway, that is, sometimes it's nice to help. My Kent District Library is a county library, and we can get upwards of $700,000 a year in penal fines. And then we've already gotten 400,000. There's so many variables that it should never be used as part of your funding for the year. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, and then Another funding source would be state aid to libraries. Now, we have mentioned this a little bit in our discussion so far. So state aid to libraries falls under the State Aid to Libraries Act. The current act is circa 1977, but this state aid has actually been given to libraries for many decades before that. The current act permits the legislature, so it doesn't require the legislature, but it permits the legislature to appropriate funds in order to provide a per capita amount to eligible libraries. So our state association, so Michigan Library Association, MLA, who lobbies with the legislature and advocates with the legislature, has done an excellent job of maintaining the amount of state aid and increasing the state aid. So last year, this is 2023, but in 2024, our state aid remained stagnant. So it was the same amount, which equaled about 50 cents per capita. We're hoping this year to get more. I was in a legislative meeting today, and the scuttlebutt, if you will, is that it's going to go up a little bit. So hopefully the legislature will maintain that in the budget. In order for a library to receive penal fines, there are some requirements written into the law. So one is they have to receive three-tenths of a mil of local support. So that means your total local support that you receive has to equal at least 3/10 of a mil of your taxable value. Every year, your librarian, your most often it's a library director, sometimes it's other people, depending on how big you are, fills out a report and submits that report to the Library of Michigan. That's another one of the requirements, is an annual application, annual report. And that is done between October and February. And that report states how much money you receive, what you receive in local support, what you receive in pretty much every kind of funding that you possibly get. But what we look at is local support. And local support, as we said, could be your penal fines, it's your millage, your appropriations. It could be if someone gave you a donation. If the library charges fines on overdue books, that's a local support. But it has to equal at least that 3/10 of a mil of your taxable value. Your staff has to comply with certification requirements. And the certification requirements can slightly differ depending on the class size of your library. There are 6 classes of libraries. It's determined by your population. So a class 1 library is the smallest amount of population served, up to a class 6, which would be your very big systems like Kent District, Cattle, Kalamazoo Public Library. So the big libraries that are serving large populations would be a class 6. Depending on your class size, the certification of your librarians, either your library director, and as you get bigger, you have to have then also a staff member added to that, goes anywhere from a high school diploma and some experience at the lowest level at a class 1 library, smallest, I shouldn't say lowest, smallest, all the way up to a director of a class 6 who would require a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in library science and 4 years of experience. So it's very important that if you're hiring a new director, that you make sure that that new director is capable of being certified at the appropriate level. Because if they're not, then you run the risk of not receiving your state aid for that year. And kind of like penal fines, depending on your size and depending on your populations that you serve, that can be a small amount of money, and it can also be a big amount of money. So again, that's something that you want to pay very close attention to. The requirements for certification are on a link at the resources page at the end of this presentation. It's on the Library of Michigan website so that you can see what are the specific requirements per class size and what class your library would be. There's also information. There is a staff member at the Library of Michigan. His name is Joe Hamlin. He is the penal fine, the state aid, and the certification coordinator. And he is someone who could walk you through and help you out if you're experiencing issues. There is the possibility with state aid to libraries, there is a waiver option where, let's say you hire a director and that director maybe has one more semester of their MLS. They're in grad school and they have one more semester to go. You can apply for a waiver. And generally, the criteria for a waiver is that when you request a waiver, you have to state your plan for resolving the problem. If your problem is that your director isn't qualified, well, how are you going to get them qualified? What is the likelihood they're going to be qualified? If it's that you don't meet the 3/10 of a mil, it's not often that people get a waiver for that because it's something that's very difficult to overcome. But we did have a library this year that did receive a waiver because they didn't meet the 3/10 of a mil because there was a very large employer in their municipality that had not paid their taxes because of an issue. And so the municipality was getting the taxes from this entity, and it was a big enough amount of money that it was preventing the library's millage share was preventing them from receiving their 3/10 of a mil. So that's the kind of thing where we knew they were going to get the money. It's just a matter of timing. And so they would get a waiver. It is the state librarian that determines whether or not a waiver is going to happen. So your request goes to the state librarian. So it's the 3/10 of a mil, compliance with certification, and that annual submission of the application report is what you need to do in order to receive state aid. Now, one thing to know about state aid is that if you are ineligible for state aid for whatever reason, you not only lose the money, you lose other things, because state aid is also tied to most of the cooperatives require that you have to be state aid eligible to be a member. You will have trouble getting maintaining your E-rate or receiving LSTA grants because that's federal money. And the definition in the federal government for public libraries is a library that is eligible for state aid because every state has state aid. So if you're not eligible for state aid in your state, then that kind of affects your ability to be considered a public library to the federal government, which can affect your ability to take part in federal government programs and receive grant monies from the federal government. Cloud websites and your cooperative membership, as I said. Now, the cooperative membership is a big one because you would deal individually with your cooperative because each cooperative has different rules and requirements and procedures for how they work with members who lose state aid eligibility. But if you aren't a part of your co-op, that may affect your ability to have certain products. If you have Overdrive or you have Hoopla through your cooperative, or you have your library automation system, right? Your check-in, check-out system through your cooperative, it could put that in danger as well. So there's a lot of things to consider. It's not just not getting the money, it's also getting all of these other features and these other services. So when you consider, something like hiring a director that doesn't meet the state aid eligibility, and this is probably one of the most common reasons a library does not meet state aid, and it's been happening actually more and more. So if you're thinking you're going to hire a director for whatever reason who does not meet state aid eligibility, you might want to ask a few questions and think about it a little harder when you consider what you might lose. You may be able to stay part of your cooperative, but you'd have to pay out of pocket instead of using your state aid monies to pay for your cooperative. So these are all things that you'd have to make a decision on, and they can be pretty important. So all of this information is available in other places, including your director. So what's important to remember is remain state aid eligible and ask the questions as you're making decisions that could affect your state aid eligibility. Shirley, would you like to comment on that?
Yes, no, that that is so true. And you're right. There's been more errors lately on that. Also, to those of you that are new trustees, it wasn't always 50 plus cents for state aid per capita. I can remember, I've been around 30 plus years, when we had 19 cents per capita. We had 39 cents per capita. When the law was put into effect, it was to top out at 50 cents per capita. Well, now things have grown and we've gone above that. But if you look at that and you think, oh my gosh, we've never always had this. This is something that we've been building up to, and once in a while it'll drop down. It did reach 50 cents per capita way back when John Engler was governor, but then that backed back down again. But all the rules that Claire has pointed out here is so important. I've been involved in it, and it is very, very important that you follow the rules. Joe is the person to call if you have questions, and has helped a lot of people solve this dilemma. So, but I just wanted to make sure that new trustees didn't think that we always got over 50 cents per capita, along with the co-op getting their share. I was on the co-op board 32 years, so I know a little bit what co-ops get also. So anyway, thanks for letting me share that, Claire.
Okay, we have some other sources here. I want to make one more comment about state aid. So just so you can look at it from big picture. So think of state aid as a three-legged stool. So if you think of the three legs, so we get state aid as like a one appropriation, right? Or somewhere around $15 million, maybe a little bit more. A third of that money goes to the cooperatives right away. A third of that money goes to the public libraries right away. The last third is money that is in the statute is allocated to the public libraries, but for use to pay the cooperatives for service. So in reality, the cooperatives receive 2/3 of state aid and the public libraries receive 1/3. But one of those thirds, of those three, is given to the cooperatives in order for the cooperatives to serve those public libraries. So that's that kind of helps you figure out, okay, how in big picture with how this system kind of works. Some other sources and programs where you get money is the personal property tax reimbursement, or we call it the PPT reimbursement. This essentially is when the business tax was repealed, many millage holders in municipalities were losing out on revenue, right? Because here's a tax now that had been collected and was no longer being collected. So the state agreed to reimburse those millage holders as a consequence of repealing the law, reimbursing those millage holders with amounts of money to kind of compensate them for that revenue they were no longer receiving. The money comes from the state's 6% sales tax. Treasury calculates the amount of money that your library is due. Now, in order to receive this money, your library, first of all, has to have a millage. It has to have had a millage in 2014-15 when the personal property tax was repealed. And then every year, Treasury looks at your area and it calculates your loss. Now, depending on various things that may be happening in your area, whether you get a new big box store, whether, different things that happen can affect your amount of money you may receive from year to year. And there may be a time when you don't get it anymore because Treasury has determined that, you are fully whole again. You no longer need the compensation. There is a very good website at Treasury for the PPT that provides a lot of explanation and provides spreadsheets that tells you how much money different entities are getting. So Treasury calculates the amount of money, and then it's the local community stabilization authority, which was created by statute, that actually cuts the checks. So it's two entities working together for this program. If you have a question about how much money you should be getting in PPT, you would call Treasury. If you have a question about why haven't you received your check, you would call the local community stabilization authority. There's a certain kind of hierarchy in which they pay. They pay schools first. They pay district libraries, and then municipal libraries. So every library that is not a district is then paid as part of their municipality. So in many instances, your municipality will receive a big check with a list saying this much money goes to the police millage, this much money is for the road millage, this much money is for the library. So that would be, if you don't see the PPT money, then it would be a talk with your municipality to say, hey, we know we should be getting this. Why aren't we getting it? Now, there are some municipal libraries that have called the local community stabilization authority and arranged to have a check sent directly to the library instead of the municipality. So that may be a possibility as well. The next pot of money, so to speak, would be TIFA exemption. Now, this is not so much as an amount of money they're paying you. It's more an amount of money you get to keep. So if you have an authority in your municipality, so a TIFA, a DDA, a corridor improvement association, all of these, or authority, all of these entities, a lot of times capture part of millages, right? So the legislature, with advocacy from MLA, included public libraries as an entity that would be exempt from capture for every millage passed after January 1st, 2017. If your millage was passed before December 31st, 2016, or I'm sorry, yeah, if your millage was passed before January 1st, 2017, it may still be subject to capture. Or you may be able to request exemption if all of the obligations of the authority, so an easy way to put that would be the project that they're capturing your millage for, has been completed and all of the bills and contractual obligations are paid. You can request, or you can say, we're going to be exempted from this. For any millage that was passed after December 31st, 2016, those millages are automatically exempt. And this is important because whether it was a renewal of your millage or whether it was a new millage, it's exempt. And you shouldn't have to do anything for it to be exempt. It should automatically be exempt. So if any of you have a millage that was passed after December 31st, 2016, and it is being captured, and you did not agree for it to be captured, because the only way it can be captured is through a written agreement between the library and the authority, then it's important that you talk to your municipal clerk and say, hey, this should not be captured, because it's illegal for them to capture it for a millage passed after December 31st, 2016, unless you have that written agreement. The only one exemption is that if you are a city library and you are requesting an exemption, your city, like your city council or your mayor, has veto power over that request for exemption. So if you have a millage pre-2017, sorry, and you say, hey, you know what? This project's done. They were going to create this garden area in front of the city hall and they've done it and we should be able to get exempt. Your city has to weigh in on that. And if your city decides no, then you're stuck with it being captured. But for most library types, you should be able to exempt out affirmatively prior to December 31st, 2016, and after January 1st, 2017, it should no longer be exempted. So essentially, you have a millage that was passed after December 31st, 2016, no capture. Prior to that, it's probably still being captured, but you should have the option to exempt if all of the obligations for that particular project have been completed. So I know it gets a little complicated and technical, but it's definitely worth asking about. So if you're not sure, it would be worth talking to your attorney. Your director or you can shoot me a note, and I'd be happy to start you on the process and also provide you with names of an attorney to continue. Sometimes the municipalities can be a little stubborn about this, but there are millions of dollars that are being captured by these local authorities. And in some cases, the libraries don't know that they don't have to be captured. So it's important to take a look at your current millages and see if you are still being captured. Shirley, is there anything you'd like to add about that?
No, you're totally correct on that. And there are some that try to renew it, thinking that that's going to skate by. And so you do have to be on your toes with that one.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Very good, Claire.
Right. And if you are being captured, if the authority is going to broaden the boundary of the project or is going to change the financing of the project, they have to have a public meeting. And at that point, you can also opt out. You can exempt your millage at that point as well. Marijuana tax. We get a lot of questions about this. Libraries were not included in the receipt of marijuana tax payments. However, if your municipality has dispensaries and your municipality has marijuana retailers, and so you are part of this tax program where you receive money from the state, because your municipality receives money, there's nothing to say that you or your director couldn't have a discussion with your municipality and say, hey, can we have some of that money? We have these projects going on and we think we could make good use of it. But you do not get automatically money from marijuana. Now we're going to kind of shift from receiving money to spending money. So for most library establishment types, the board is in control of the expenditures of the money. So it's important to understand public money and public expenditures. So in Michigan, Michigan as a state has opted into what's called the public purpose doctrine with the expenditure of public funds. This pretty much means that you can only spend public funds when the expenditure is for a public purpose and not for the individual benefit. So here are some kind of tips in order to comply with that. All money in your library accounts are public funds, whether you receive them from your friends group, whether you receive them from a large donation from a bequest, whether you receive them from, members of the public paying library fees, whether it's penal fines, whether it's state aid, whether it's your millage, all of it's considered public funds. As I mentioned, under the public purpose doctrine, you can only be spent for operations of the library and the fulfillment of its mission. Many expenses that you may think as common expenses are not permitted. So for example, anything and parties for the staff, you cannot pay for. Coffee for the staff break room, cannot pay for that. Dinners for boards are as part of their meetings might be permitted under certain circumstances, but if you're having a board meeting at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, chances are that is going to be an inappropriate expense. You cannot pay for Christmas gifts for the staff, flowers because somebody is sick, flowers because somebody died. All of those expenditures are not appropriate, are not legal public expenditures. So how do you do this kind of thing? Well, your best bet would be to talk to either the friends of your library, or if you're fundraise for a staff recognition program. And as long as the people who are donating specifically earmark that money for a staff recognition program, then that is okay. If they just donate money to the library, then that goes in the library coffers, and that's your general fund. Friends of the library, depending on how your friends are set up, most friends should be a nonprofit corporation in the state. Many of them are also 501c3s. There are many different considerations for being a 501c3. If your friends are designated a 501c3 because they're a public charity, then they also have public purpose restrictions on their expending. But because they're a corporation and not a government entity, sometimes they may have a little more flexibility. So it would be up to you or your director to talk to your friends about the possibility of donations for some of those things. You want to make sure you have adequate financial policies and financial controls. And that financial manual I mentioned that we have is an excellent source to look at that. There are some policies that are mandated by statute. If you have a credit card, you have to have a credit card policy. You have to have a policy if you receive or you spend money electronically. If you have a credit card, you can only have a credit card for the library. If you are any type of library other than a district library, the only way you can have a credit card is if you get permission to have one through your municipality. Because you are not your own public corporation, you can't have your own credit card. It's because of a stupid definition in the law governing credit cards for government entities. But right now, unfortunately, that's the way the law is written. All of those require a policy. You have to have a policy for investment, to invest public funds. That's also required by the statute. So it's important that you have all of those policies in place. Now, depending on how you work with your municipality with your money, okay, so if you are a PA 164, so again, a township, a city, or a village library, unless you're a city library that is a department of the city, so you have no board, you only have an advisory board, then your sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Then your financial, the way that a PA 164 library is set up is that the municipality holds the money in the treasury, but the library board is in charge of determining the expenditures and is in charge of setting the budget. The municipality has no say in the library budget. It is the board, the governing board, that determines the budget and passes the budget. Many libraries use their municipality as a fiscal agent. So the municipality not only pays their bills, which they have to under the statute, cut their checks, but they also, deal with their invoices and keep track of their accounting and help with their investment. Now, if your municipality does that for the library, then you should have a fiscal agency agreement, a written agreement with your municipality, because that states what are the expectations of the board in terms of reporting, and in terms of making sure the appropriate policies are in place, who has access to the money. And then it also sets boundaries for the municipality to know this is what we're required to do, and these are the things we're responsible for, and this is how much money the library is going to pay us to do this for them. Keeping the money in the treasury and cutting your checks is a function that this municipality should not charge you for, because it's statutory. It's a statutory duty, and that's part of their regular budget. But anything in addition to that are things that you might pay an accountant for. So you may consider paying your municipality to do that. If your municipality does payroll, then that's another thing that is a little bit outside the scope of their required duties. That's something that the library is delegating to that municipality. If your library staff receive benefits like health benefits through the municipality, then that may change the legal employer of the library staff. A lot of times, if the staff receive benefits, particularly health benefits, through the municipality, then they are almost always legally considered municipal employees. And then the municipality leases them back to the library so that the library has legal jurisdiction over the employees for hiring, firing, all that kind of thing. So these are things to ask your attorney and things to double check with your director and look at your paperwork. Because you don't want to be stuck in a situation where you're having an issue with an employee and then you come to find out that you're not especially if it's like an ADA problem or a discrimination problem, and then you find out, oh, we're not the legal employer of this employee. And so that's, right now there's some changes in overtime rules at the federal government that were just instituted. That's another situation where you're going to want to make sure you know who is the legal employer of your library staff. So your finances are a very big deal. So it's very important that you have the proper controls and proper policies in place. You should be looking at your audit every year. Doesn't matter. Your municipality can certainly do your audit as part of theirs, or you can do it yourself. You can pay the auditor yourself from the library and have it done. Whichever way you do it, make sure you receive a copy of the report from the auditor and make sure that you have the ability to ask the auditor questions if you have any. So that's, and always go back and read it. Right now, there's so much controversy going on in a lot of libraries that one of the things that citizens look at is low-hanging fruit. Problems with your finances is low-hanging fruit. And there are lots of people out there who want to create trouble for public libraries. And so you don't want to make it easy for them to create a problem that could possibly interfere with your ability to get your millage renewal or, get your new building or fundraise because of a dumb financial mistake or the lack of a policy. So these are things that, as the fiduciary for the library, these are things that the board are squarely in charge of and should be on top of. The fund balance. Most auditors and most accountants will tell you that you really should have no more than 6 months or less of operational money in your fund balance. So in other words, the fund balance is there so that if the library, God forbid, doesn't get their millage, you have a pot of money there that will enable the library to continue to operate while you wait for the next election cycle to put your millage up again. Or if you have some kind of disaster that creates a financial difficulty, that fund balance allows you to continue to operate and pay payroll until you get that difficulty overcome. It should be no more than about six months or less of that operational. It could go to 12 months, but that's considered a lot. So if your library is carrying a huge fund balance in relation to your annual budget, that could be a problem. And what you might want to do is look into investing some of that money or using that money. Your millage from your public is being given to you for library services. It's not being given to you so that you can sit on it and not do anything with it. So you could get pinged on an audit if your fund balance is too large. So that's something else to kind of pay attention to and determine what you do with, these funds if it's in excess. Shirley, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
No, that is something that we discuss commonly when we're doing millages. How big a fund balance has it been set aside for other needs, and what kind of fund balance are you just getting in the open checking account? So no, it is a very important issue, and thank you for touching on that.
Yeah,
a lot of people have think it's good to have all this money, but not with anything written in there or no line item that it's going to be used for.
Right.
So that, but thank you.
So it's okay to have money. Let's say you're going to build a new building, or you're saving money for a big project like a new roof or a new HVAC system, or it's okay to hold money for that, but then you might want to have a separate capital projects fund balance.
Exactly.
And instead of keeping it mingled in the fund balance with everything else, because if you have a huge fund balance, and like Shirley said, you go out for your millage renewal or a millage, you're going to have members of the public say, well, why should I give you a millage, or why should I increase your millage, or why should I renew your millage if you're sitting on $500,000 or $200,000 fund balance? And that's a very legitimate question. So those are the kinds of things you want to consider. Okay, another way to get money is fundraising, right? So the Friends of the Library, if you have one, as we mentioned, is a nonprofit corporation. It is not part of the library. It does not, it is not governed by the library board. It is a completely separate entity. Usually they have to be a nonprofit corporation. They have to be registered with the Attorney General under the Charitable Organization and Solicitations Act, because they are fundraisers. They may be a 501c3. It's recommended that you have a written agreement with your friends group. So kind of a memorandum. Sometimes they're called a memorandum of understanding. It could also just be a contract where the library lays out its expectations for the friends group, and the friends group lays out its expectations for the library. Use of space in the library proper for the friends group to do their work. Receiving the donated books for the friends group. On the library side, it could be who determines how much money the library gets, who determines how the money is spent, because the money raised by the friends group legally is their money. It's not the library's money. Doesn't become the library's money until the library, it's handed over to the library. So your friends group as a separate corporation can decide how that money gets, depending on what they tell people, so if they tell people, oh, we're fundraising to build a new children's room, and so people donating think they're donating to a children's room, and then they use it for something else, well, that could be a problematic with their 501c3 and the Attorney General. But you want to have an agreement to determine, okay, this is how it's decided how much money we get and what it's spent on. So it's a very good idea to have a written agreement with your friends group. And then your board in your bylaws should have a policy on the participation of board members on the friends group. Board members should not be officers in the friends group. So if you're on the library board, you should not be on the board of the friends. You can participate in the friends as a member, but you can't be a decision maker, because it is a conflict of interest. And the way you can look at it is, as the library board member, you are the interested party who wants to receive the money. As the board member on the friends group, you're the interested decision maker who gets to decide how to give the money. So the person who receives the money should not also be the person who decides how to give the money. So that's why friends group members should not be, if you're on the board of the friends, you shouldn't be on the board of the library. If you're on the board of the library, you should not be on the board of the friends. It doesn't mean you can't participate in the friends, but you're not a decision maker, because that presents some conflict of interest issues. Self-fundraising. Now, as a library, you can fundraise on your own. You are tax exempt as a government entity. Libraries can be 501c3s, but probably the only reason to really do that as a library would be if you're going to be going after very large grants, because you already are tax exempt under the Internal Revenue Code. As a government entity, it's under a different section of the Internal Revenue Code, so it's not under 501c, it's under another section, but it's the same effect. So you can fundraise. You would want to have a gift policy. So of course you want to have a policy that says, Here's the gifts we really don't want. So things like you don't want property, like buildings, like an apartment building or a condo. You want to be careful of receiving stock because libraries as government entities cannot hold stock. So if you receive stock, you'd have to sell it right away. You probably want to be careful of receiving things like artwork or tangible things that might be hard and expensive to then get evaluated and sell. So there's different considerations to gifts and donations. You cannot fundraise for your millage campaign. The library can't. Your Yes Committee can, but your library cannot. You'd also have to be registered with the Attorney General under the Charitable Organization and Solicitation Act, which is the law that governs fundraising in the state. You would have to adhere to certain record keeping and accounting requirements. There's a couple laws that specifically address donated money and laws of things like identifying donors and the privacy of donors. So there are some extra things that you'd have to learn and extra requirements that you'd have to get used to, but you certainly could fundraise like anything else. It's a matter of learning what those requirements are, and then having a plan to adhere to them. There's also things like you want to have a fundraiser in the library building. Well, there's several things to consider about that. If you're going to have alcohol, if you're going to have like a raffle, or you're going to have gambling, there's other things that you may have to get licenses or permission for. But that doesn't mean it's not doable. It means that you just have to have a plan, and you have to just understand what the requirements are. Shirley, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, thank you. That is good, though. There is a lot of confusion sometimes to that. I've run into it with different libraries. And so thank you for clarifying that.
One of the big issues that can crop up with self-fundraising is staff. So if your library barely has enough staff to keep the doors open and take care of all the work the library has in just providing service, then it might not be a good idea to say, hey, let's do fundraising too. And that's where a friends group can come in. There are laws in Michigan about public officials receiving gifts, but that's different than fundraising. So someone giving me, like if I go see a vendor and the vendor wants to give me a trip to somewhere, that could be a problem. So at the state level, we're restricted to anything under $25. So if someone takes me out to lunch, most of the time that's okay. If I get a free mug, most of the time that's okay. And that would be okay for your staff too. But chances are your municipality has some rules for personal gifts, and also like gifts from vendors and stuff. And your municipality may also have an ethics ordinance, which is something that you'd want to look into, because that can cover some of this stuff and you'd be required to follow that as well. Okay, your relationship with your library director. And so this is one of the stickiest, can be one of the most difficult parts of this kind of training. So the library director and the board have a very symbiotic relationship, right? In order for the library to work, these two entities have to get along, right? They have to work well together. They don't have to like each other, but they have to respect and get along, work well together. Because if they don't, then nothing works. If you have a board and a director that are at odds, that ripples through the entire library services experience. It ripples through the staff, it ripples through members of the public, it ripples through the friends group. It can create more havoc and damage than I can tell you. So even though the director is an employee of the board, in fact, the director is often the only direct employee of the board. The other staff members are often supervised by the library director. But the director is also a partner with the board, right? Because if you look at it, the director has all of the industry knowledge, right? And the professional understanding of how a library works, right? And how day to day things happen, where the board has all of the authority, right? And all of the legal power in order to get things done. So if you don't work together, then nothing gets done, or worse, bad things get done, or things that aren't helpful get done. Your job, one of your many jobs as a board, is to delegate to the director authority and responsibilities, right? In the statutes, the library establishment statutes that we talked about last week, they list what the board powers are. They don't say anything about a director. They don't say anything about what the director's powers are. That's because the director has no inherent powers or duties under the statute. The board has them all, but it's the board's job to delegate the powers and duties to the director, to draft the job description and decide what responsibilities and authority that director will have, right? And best practices, like any other industry, right? Libraries have best practices over the hundreds of years that libraries have existed in this country, about 150 years. It's kind of been determined what works well and what doesn't work well. So you want to make sure that you provide enough autonomy to your director so that they can successfully complete and successfully execute the expectations that you put on them. If you're charging them with, helping fundraise or working with the Friends group, then you have to give them enough authority to approve things that the Friends group wants to do within reason. If you want them to make sure that the library is well stocked with good materials, then you have to give them enough authority to authorize purchases of, or at least ordering of, certain materials. You want to authorize them to draft policies that then you would approve before they're implemented. So, that's why you would design the job description. And luckily, hopefully, the director and you would do job descriptions together, right? So the director's job description would be done by the board with some input from the director. The staff job descriptions would be done by the director and then approved by the board with input from the board. Look at how other libraries work, right? If you are in other parts of the state and you see libraries, wow, this is really nice. Look at how other libraries work, right? And then talk to your director. Hey, I noticed this, and is there a way we could do this? There may be good reasons why you can't, but always keep your eyes open to see how different libraries work, because that can inform your ability to make certain decisions and to, create innovation. Keep up with the American Library Association, with the Public Library Association, and other industry authorities, and see how they view the director's position, and how there's also United for Libraries that we talked about last week, that is made up of all trustees. Talk to them about different states. How do you deal with your director? You're all people. You're all professionals. We're all grown-ups. So as I said, even if you don't particularly like each other, doesn't mean you can't work together. What's important is that you keep your communications open and that you come at the situation from a place of respect. And generally you do that and things work out pretty well. I also want to talk a minute about what happens if you have a board member that maybe you get along great with the director, everything works well, but there's some problems, inter-board issues, right? So some of that should be able to be solved by your bylaws. So usually the president of the board or your chair is the position charged with, for lack of a better word, keeping other board members in line. So if you have board members that are running off and executing policy on their own, so are acting unilaterally, are creating dissension, are disrespecting the director and staff, then these are things that a president would want to initially pull the member over aside discreetly and say, hey, what's the problem? Why are you doing things? This is not how we operate. And training, like this kind of training and other board trainings can be very useful. Sometimes board members act inappropriately because they just don't know. They don't realize that they're not supposed to do that. They get excited, they want to do things, and they just don't realize. Ultimately, if you have a situation that can't be dealt with internally, then one of your best options is to seek out a consultant like Shirley, who works with boards to kind of get a consensus about how to work together in a constructive way. I've done that. I know that some of the attorneys have done that. Shirley has done that. What you don't want is to pull your director in and put them in the middle, because that puts them in an incredibly awkward position. And then that doesn't work well for anybody. Shirley, do you have anything you'd like to say about that?
No, I think you're right on the dime there. Boards and directors it's a continuing building a team. Obviously, there's a turnover of trustees quite often, more so than the turnover of directors and trustees, however that happens also. But you need to continue to work at building a team. Obviously, your jobs are different, totally different. However, you need to complement each other on what you're doing. And team building is always going to far succeed when you have a board and directors. And no micromanaging. Obviously, that's been a big word for years and years as a library board of trustees and a director. But I just feel that if you can build a team, complement each other, work together, that you can't have anything but a very successful library.
Well said. So also, you get what you pay for and support. So, I'm sure all of you that, have careers and have worked outside the home, and, especially if you've managed people, we all know that if you pay salaries and benefits that are fair market price and are what the industry is showing, then you end up with a much happier, much more contented workforce that provides much better service and that stays in their jobs. You don't get a lot of turnover. If you support continuing education and networking opportunities for your staff, support the ability to go to conferences, to go in state, to opportunities to work with peers. Do you have to let them go to every conference? No. Most of the jobs I've been in, we took turns with national conferences. You'd take turns. You go this year to ALA, next year, the next reference librarian goes, and maybe you go to an in-state conference. So it's, but it's important that everybody get that chance to network, because that is so valuable in our industry with providing service and keeping up with all of the new things that are happening. The Library of Michigan offers stipends to library staff. We just raised it to about $1,800 per person per year they can apply for to go to conferences. So $1,800 can take a big bite out of a conference cost. So, you could levy that and you end up being the good guy. Yeah, we're going to let you go. And hey, you can get money from the Library of Michigan and we'll fill in the gap. Do your homework, before you start looking at salaries and benefits. Maybe see how your library compares to other libraries of your size and your budget. What are they doing? What are they offering their staff? Because the library world is a very small world. And you may think that your staff doesn't know what's going on at other libraries, but you'd be wrong. People talk librarians talk back and forth. So people know what's the good library to work for. And what's the bad library to work for? What library is problematic? What board is problematic? And so look to see how your library compares with the things you can have metrics for, benefits, salary, staff size. If you're a fairly big library, but you're keeping your staff to very marginal numbers so that everybody is continuously overstressed, that's not great either. Surveys to the public and internal surveys to your staff to see how things are going, right? Because a lot of times boards may not know when there's a problem until the problem has gotten so bad that it's affecting service, or until there's some kind of blowout or problem. Stay out of personnel issues until they're brought to you. So what I mean by that is let the director do their job. If the director's job is to manage the staff, let the director manage the staff. We all know that managers are not always popular. And so at any point in time, you may have an employee that is not happy about something. That doesn't mean the director did something wrong, right? It could mean the director did something very right. So if a staff member comes to you and complain, one of the first responses should always be, have you talked to the director about this? Go back and talk to the director about this. And then you could go to the director and say, hey, just want to let you know, so-and-so came up to me and mentioned this, this, and this. And talk to them about it. Don't try to solve the problem yourself. Don't tell the employee, oh, I'll take care of this, right? We all know from managing staff and from being employees that every story has more than one version, right? And more than one perspective. And there's always things we don't know. So last thing you want to do is get in the middle of something like that. It just will cause you nothing but grief. Now, you do that and the staff member comes back to you and it's a continuing problem and you've talked to the director, there are going to be instances when maybe you do need to get involved, but those should be hopefully few and far between. If you have a discrimination issue, a sexual harassment issue, of course, a ADA issue, those are always going to be, issues that, yes, the board at some point is probably going to have to get involved in that if it doesn't get resolved. But hopefully 99% of the time, sending the employee back to the director and then touching base with the director will solve the problem and initiate some kind of resolution. Communicate with your director often. Maybe have a liaison from the board whose job it is to touch base with the director every week, just to pop their head in. Doesn't have to be a full-blown meeting. Pop your head in and say, hey, how you doing? You okay? And if the director needs something, they have an opportunity to say. If the director just needs to vent, the director has an opportunity to vent. But it's not in public meeting and it's informal. It could be just a cup of coffee, right? Most well-run business, personnel manager relationships have a point of regular contact where you check in with each other and say, hey, everything okay? And the director can do that with the board too. Talk to the liaison. Hey, is everything going okay? Is there anything, that I'm not addressing that's rising to the top for you that you want me to bring to the next board meeting? And so these touch points are important. Shirley, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
No, I think you're right on the money. That should be a constant director trustee relationship. Ask, like you said, is things going smooth? Is there anything we need to talk about? Is this happening? Is that happening? Without looking like you are trying to butt in. And sometimes we hear, as trustees, we hear hearsay and we hear little rumblings. And I think it's on our behalf that we talk to the director and make sure that it doesn't go beyond first base. We want to have a smooth running library. And some of our libraries have very large staffs, and so things can get really carried away. But no, thank you. I think you really hit it on the money, and that is something that we need to continue to have an open dialogue at all times.
And I see there's some questions in the chat, and we will get to those. So essentially, we've talked about a lot of these. The main thing I want to just kind of mention on here is you got to work together to build and maintain trust. And having that trust is what's going to save you from problems. It's building that trust between the board and the director. Like I said, it doesn't mean you have to be each other's best friends. It just means a matter of respect and professional courtesy. Okay, let's talk about open and transparent. So under the First Amendment, there is the part of the First Amendment covers 6 different rights. It's a lot, right? It's not just freedom of speech, but it also covers the ability to petition your government, right? The ability to get information from your government. So most states, just about every state, has what you might call a right to know law, and a law that preserves the ability of members of the public, of their citizenry, to participate and understand what's going on in government and participate in the actions of their government. So these are called the Freedom of Information Act and the Open Meetings Act. Under the Freedom of Information Act, there is also a component that governs public records. So in order to have a Freedom of Information Act, which states that members of the public have access to all of the documents and information produced by their government, there has to be a way to maintain that information, right? To hold those records. So under FOIA, government entities are required to hold certain records and to preserve them for a certain amount of time. And there are retention schedules that they're called in Michigan that list for public libraries the different materials you have to keep and how long you have to keep them. Under the Freedom of Information Act, which provides the different mechanisms that members of the public can access these records, there are a few types of records that are exempted. And most of the time, these are things like medical records, student records, library records. Now, when I say library records, I mean patron records. So a list of what people have checked out. That's protected under the Library Privacy Act. There are also other laws. For example, if you have a communication from your attorney over a problem that maybe the library is having, that communication would be private under attorney-client privilege. But anything that doesn't fall within one of these other laws that governs the privacy of information, so things like, if your employee has accessed medical benefits, or if there's an ADA accommodation for an employee, the information on why there's an accommodation and their medical information would all be privileged. 99%, or maybe 95.9% of all of the information that is generated by and in a public library is public record, including many things that you may think are not public record, right? So when you're under FOIA, sometimes there are things that you personally may consider private, but because it's a public entity, it is not considered private. Under FOIA, there are we talked about the records retention. You have to have a FOIA coordinator and you have to have a FOIA policy. That's another policy that's required by law on your website. If you don't have a policy on your website, it could inhibit the ability of you to charge members of the public for FOIA information. You may be partnering with your municipality to cover the library FOIA requests, and that's fine. You just have to make sure that you know who is the FOIA coordinator for your library and make sure there's a FOIA policy published that includes the libraries. Some of the things to know about FOIA, we're not going to go into a huge amount of step-by-step detail because there is a lot. You want to avoid using your personal email for library work. You want to avoid using your personal phone texting for private work. Why? Because any documents that you generate, right, is public record. So if you have a conversation with the director on text over library business, that's FOIAble. If there is some kind of controversy, someone could request those, and then you'd have to go back and pull them off your device. If you are embroiled in a lawsuit, your phone could be subpoenaed so that they can pull stuff off of it. So it's in your best interest to keep everything separate. Okay, so your library should be willing to give you an email account that's the library email. If they can't, some municipalities are funny about that. If they can't, then you could just have a Google account, trustee at blanklibrary.google.com, or trustee1 any town library at google.com. If you make them generic, so that president of the board blank library at google.com, then that means that your director would have access to those emails to pull things up for you if they're FOIA'd. And they also, the records retention requires that some of the emails get stored because it's considered a correspondence. So, there is a whole lot of things connected with your email. So it's best not to have your personal email be the way that you communicate with members of the public for the library, with each other. Common public records, so things like your bylaws, library policies, the budget, should be very easily available, preferably on your website, so that members of the public can just get them. They don't have to file a FOIA. Not only is that easier for your library staff, it's just good customer service, and it's just good governance from a government standpoint, to be that transparent. Look, yeah, here's our policies, here's our budget, here's the bylaws, because it's all public record anyway. So you might as well throw it up on the website, and then it saves time and effort in dealing with FOIAs. There is a subtlety to interboard communications, so you should talk to your attorney about the correct FOIA processes for interboard communications. So notes you write to yourself in a board meeting, those are not public record. But if you're in a committee and there's like draft reports or outlines, that all would be public record. So, if there's a question, it's always good to check with your attorney, because the penalties for violating FOIA can be a little bit stiff. And that's why, yeah, if there's if you're not sure if something is available under FOIA, like you have to turn it over, definitely want to check with your attorney. Sometimes you have to turn it over, but you redact it. So for example, if someone in your library, a member of the public, comes and questions or challenges a particular title, which is going on a lot now, and they fill out a form, then maybe the media comes and issues a FOIA because they want a copy of that challenge request, then you would have to redact or cover up the name and the personal information of the member of the public that requested the reconsideration, and then issue it to the member of the media. So there's a lot of finesse. So it's important that if you have any questions, you do address them with your attorney. And directors are well schooled in this, so a lot of them have very good information on this. So it would be good to talk to your director as well. Shirley, do you have anything about FOIA you'd like to say?
No, it has become a hot issue. It takes up a lot of time of our staff. I know that. FOIA has become quite a four-letter word that is being used tremendously more and more. But no, you did an excellent job at relating what is included. I know it's important to have policies that address all of this. Some include charges for FOIA information, because some of it can be very lengthy. But so policies are very important to have, that the trustees should have put together to cover their and the director's issues with FOIA.
And if you, chances are you already have some kind of FOIA policy, read it so that you know what it is.
Exactly. Yep.
So one thing I want to just kind of make sure is, as I said, most of your information is open to the public. So this includes all financial information. So salaries, a list of your staff with what they make is public record. Their addresses are not public record. The name of their kids is not public record, but their names with how much they make is public record. The benefits you give your staff are public record. What kind of health benefits? How much do you pay for them? What are their deductibles and copays? Your budget, your full budget, including draft budgets, are public record. Your bills, the bills the library receives for books, how much you pay for books are public record. All expenses and reimbursements are public record. So certain personal information may be redacted. For example, credit card receipts, your name, your credit card number, all of that would get redacted out. But the receipts, what was purchased, how much it costs is all public record. Personnel evaluations are all public record. Most of your board material, like I said, except for written notes that you write yourself during a board meeting, are public record. In the Open Meetings Act, it states that, which is where we're going right now. There are some times you can go into closed session, which means it's outside the public eye, but there's only 6 reasons to go into public session for a public library. So the Open Meetings Act, whereas FOIA provides access to documents and information, the Open Meetings Act provides access to the proceedings and decision-making of government. So the Open Meetings Act provides the requirements that a board has to follow to notify and include the public in public meetings. Now, part of this is that the only time a government entity can make a decision is in a public meeting. So a public meeting is required if a board meets and there's a quorum. It's automatically you have to have a public meeting. If you're in the parking lot and y'all get together and all of a sudden you realize there's a quorum, stop talking. Talk about the weather, talk about inflation, talk about shopping, talk about your kids. Don't talk about the library. Otherwise, you'd have to have a public meeting. If you're in a committee and you have less than a quorum, but your committee is charged with having discussions and or making a decision, like if you're having discussions that lead to a decision, or you're making a decision on behalf of the board, you have to have an open meeting. You have to have a public meeting. When this most often occurs is if you are hiring a director and you have a search committee. That search committee is going to have public meetings. It can't operate in secret because they're making decisions that normally would be made by the board. Unless that search committee is reading every application, putting them in piles, not getting rid of any, not making any decisions as to who moves forward in the process and who does not, just kind of organizing and just maybe, looking them over, and then they hand everything to the board and say, this is the pile that we believe look good. This is the pile of everybody else. And they hand everything over to the board. But they cannot make any decisions. If you want that search committee to make decisions and hold interviews, even phone interviews, then they have to do it in public meeting. You have to take minutes and make those minutes available to the public within 5 days of Yeah, I think it's 8 days of the first meeting and then 5 days of the final minutes. So the initial minutes, the unapproved minutes, have to be available to the public within 8 days, and then the approved minutes have to be available within 5. So yeah, that we talked about all of this, the quorum and the you cannot exclude any member of the public. So every member of the public that might want to attend your meeting has to attend the meeting. You have to have public comment, and you have to permit everybody in that meeting who wants to talk to talk. So if you're there until 1 a.m. in the morning because you have a lot of people that want to talk, you have to stay there. You cannot have a rule that says we have an hour of public comment or a half hour of public comment. You have to have public comment until there's nobody left that wants to speak. If you meet in a small room and you have more people arrive to the meeting than the room fits, you have to either adjourn or move to a bigger room. You cannot prevent people from attending a meeting because the room is too small. Any public participant can record or broadcast that meeting without permission or notice. So I could go into your public meeting, turn on my phone, record the meeting, and post it on Facebook or any other Instagram, TikTok without your knowledge and without your permission. What the board can do is regulate if you have someone, with a camera and they're standing in the aisle and they're impeding, people going egress, or they're blocking the door, or they're creating like a fire hazard, you can regulate that, but you can't prohibit them from recording. Closed sessions, you want to be very careful. There's the Attorney General produces a very good open meetings handbook. There's a link to it on the notes page at the end of this presentation. It's an easy read. I would strongly suggest you all read it. It goes over the permitted purposes of a closed meeting. Some of the most common ones that are misunderstood is that if you have, if you're going to be evaluating your director or another member of the staff, or there's been a complaint against them and you're going to discuss that in a public meeting, you have to discuss it in public meeting. You cannot go into closed session unless the staff member or the director, who is the subject of the discussion, requests to go into public meeting. It is up to them. It is not up to the board. So the board can't make the director go into closed meeting to discuss something. It is up to the director or the staff member to determine whether or not they want this discussed in open meeting or closed meeting. And they can decide at the last minute, and they can change their mind if they want to. If you are interviewing people for a position, a director, all interviews are in public meeting. If you have a candidate who says, oh, my employer doesn't know, I need this to be confidential, if you're doing interviews, it has to be done in public meeting. Now, you can, when you first receive the application and it says, I need this confidential, the initial inquiries can be confidential. But once it gets to the level where you would have an interview, that interview has to be done in public meeting. Cannot be done out in a committee. It cannot be done in closed session. It has to be done in public meeting. So there's a few things that, sometimes trips boards up, but if you read that open meeting handbook carefully, it's pretty self-explanatory. There are penalties if you violate the Open Meetings Act, and they're intentional. So, and if it's more than once, so at first, your first mistake is $500. If you continue to make that mistake and it's considered intentional, then it goes up to $1,000 per official per incident. So it can get kind of high very quickly, and it can get to the point where your decisions become invalidated because of an open meeting violation. So you don't want to get to that point. When you talk about open meeting, there's no such thing as a work meeting. So there's no such thing as a meeting including the quorum of the board that is meeting, oh, we're just meeting to plan. No, there's no such thing. If you're discussing library business and you have a quorum, it's a public meeting. You can have a retreat or a work meeting and have it be a public meeting, and you can hold it that way, but you can't hold it and not have it be a public meeting. You can't stand in the parking lot after a public meeting or after a library program and conduct library business. Make your plans for how you're going to vote a certain way. You can't surreptitiously do decision making so that one person goes to each individual board member and says, this is what we want to do. What do you think? What do you think? What do you think? That's considered round the horn decision making, and that's a violation. If you walk into your board meetings and all you do is vote, then that's kind of a red flag, because board meetings, open meetings, are intended to be discussions and decision making, not just walking in there with everybody already knowing how they're going to vote on every topic, because that kind of presupposes that y'all kind of had a confab before the meeting. You should be having open discussion on the issues in the meeting. When you're emailing each other, if the director sends you your board packet or sends you information, no reply all. The minute you reply all, now you're having a meeting of a quorum and you have to have a public meeting. Do not reply all in email. There's actually decisions on this. So do not reply all in a email situation. Always make your minutes easily available and make sure you're properly noticing your minutes or your meetings. One thing to remember, rule of thumb, is that so FOIA and OMA, the purpose of these acts are to provide transparency and citizen participation, right? It's intended, part of our democracy is, for the people, by the people, of the people. So part of this is to include the people, right? To include the people who are paying the taxes and making, as part of this process, so that they know how their money is being spent and they have a chance to weigh in. So if you remember that, the reason why these exist, it makes it easier for you to make some decisions on how to handle certain things. Always err on the side of transparency. It's going to be far less likely that you violate a privacy thing than it is going to be that you violate either FOIA or Open Meetings Act. If you're really not sure, talk to your attorney. It's not going to be that expensive for them to just answer the question. It's, most of them have been doing this a long time, and they know what is right and what's the right thing to do. Okay, I'm actually going to pause on intellectual freedom, and I'm going to say, oh, wait, Shirley, do you want to talk about Open Meetings Act?
No, you're totally correct. On err on the side of transparency. One of my favorite sayings forever and ever, through millage campaigns, through trustee meetings, everything. Transparency is the word, and it will keep you out of any legal wrangles from beginning to end. There's nothing that is worth hiding or discussing behind closed doors. No, transparency is the word, and everybody keep that in mind.
So I'm going to stop sharing. So I would encourage you to read those intellectual freedom information, so that you have it. And there's many more trainings on those too on our website if you want to know more, or you're welcome to ask me a question. But I want to address some of these questions. So yes, there's a question here that says that, from Carla, it seems like this would be very inconsistent funding. Most library funding can be very inconsistent. Penal fines are exceptionally inconsistent. And unfortunately, if you're a library that doesn't have a millage or a confirmed appropriation, it does put you in a very difficult situation for for maintaining your budget every year, which is why, as a board member, part of your responsibility is to make sure the library is well funded. So if your library doesn't have a millage, I know there's a lot of municipalities that really frown on millages. But it's, one of the things to do is to have an honest conversation with your municipality, if you're a municipal library, and say, hey, these are the services we can provide with this much money. And this is what we can't do. And maybe that means not having the hours you want. Maybe it means not being able to take advantage of all of the services that you'd like to provide. And that's something that, members of your community, that's something to educate members of your community on. There are lots of grants. There are lots of, different ways to get funding, but you also have to balance that against the fact that somebody has to write all those grants. And, maybe you're, depending on how big your library is and how much staff you have, your director may not have the time. And so, yeah, funding is a huge issue for libraries right now. What should be a primary funding source? So a primary funding source for public libraries should be a millage or an appropriation. Because like I said, public libraries in Michigan are created by the municipalities. They're expected to be funded by the municipalities. What examples of library services? So when I say library services, I am talking about everything from purchasing books to have on the shelf to provide to patrons. I'm talking about reference services, or when you approach a librarian at the service desk and ask them a question. Things like Melcat, which is a service that brings books from one library and to another library. So it's what we call resource sharing. So you can, a patron can request a book that your library doesn't have, and then the system tells them where the book is in Michigan and what library has it, and then they can request that that book gets sent from one library to their library. That costs money. So it's the library has to pay a certain amount of money for that. Sometimes it's through the cooperatives, but it still gets paid for. Library services are programs. So like, for example, summer reading that's going on right now, that's a library service. Providing a meeting room that's clean and a meeting room that's available and can be scheduled is a library service. Having computers in the library that members of the public can use is a library service. So everything your library provides is a service. Shirley, would you like to weigh in on that?
No, I think you hit most of it. There are so many programs out there that the library provides in one form or another, and detailed parts of the, for instance, there's some libraries that got a whole section on colleges. You want to go and see what college you'd like to go to. There's a lot of different separate issues in different libraries, but the amount of programs that are provided throughout our public libraries are just second to none in Michigan. But thank you. No, I think we really are very fortunate that we cover as many things as we do, as many details as we do. Technology is a big one. You never walk into a library without your technology department being in line waiting to use and keeping up to date on all of that. No, it's just second to none what our public libraries provide. Thanks.
So Joe asked, can a TIFA recapture millage to fund new future projects? So that's interesting. My understanding is that an authority can capture a millage for a particular project. And then when the obligations for that project are complete, the library can exempt the millage. I haven't heard of a TIFA capturing a millage to fund like a nebulous future project. I could do some research on that and check. Shirley, have you heard of that?
No, not at all.
That seems a little suspect to me. But I'm not an authority in it, but I'll definitely do the research. So
you.
Joe, if you, I would say if you shoot me an email so that I have your email, then I can send you the information. Is there any circumstance where dinner for the board of the library board meetings is acceptable? So the way that the information is written on terms of expenditures of public funds is that if you have a situation, for example, you have a project that is extending over the dinner hour, right? Or it could be a project that's extending over the lunch hour. And for example, your staff are mandated to be there, right? Then you could conceivably feed your staff or dinner or lunch. So you could say possibly that the board, if you're having a late board meeting, you could probably feed them dinner. But that is something that I would probably discuss with your lawyer because different people have different opinions on that. I know that there are lots of libraries that do it. Doesn't mean that it's okay. Part of this is a risk benefit analysis too. The reason why we mention all of these is, as I said, what you want to do is avoid somebody who is looking to stir up trouble. And so that's one of the things that, when you make these decisions, you want to be a little careful of is the Library of Michigan going to come after you because you buy pizza for your board? No. But could a member of the public who is upset at a millage look at that and be like, why are you buying it? Possibly. So the context that I have seen it okay is if, say, it's a project that you're moving books and you're reshifting the collection, and so you require the staff to be there on a Saturday, you could feed them. You have a training and you're requiring staff to work through lunch, you can feed them. So I think it might be able to be analogized to the board. You're requiring them to be there late, but I think there might be some things that are a little bit more gray there. Shirley, what do you think?
I totally agree with you. I think that's another transparency that we have to be on top of. I've never been a part of where we did that. I know that it's been questioned. I was told one time, well, if you've got a 501c3, you could order in food, you can buy gifts, and so I got out the paperwork to prove otherwise. But no, you're right. There's always somebody watching over your shoulder to see if you make a mistake, and you don't want to be a victim of it.
Yeah, I would probably err on the side of no for the library paying for it. But if you have a friends, maybe asking the friends to give money and earmark it as specifically for that. And then you have a donation where the donor has specifically determined how they want the money to be spent. And then that kind of gets you off the hook. We are considering a future capital expansion to our facility. We hope to set aside We hope to set aside annual savings in order to fund this future goal. The amount to be spent could readily exceed months of funding. How can we make future plans with adequate funding if we are limited to 12 months? So the 12 months isn't a law. That's an accounting and a recommendation. It's considered bad accounting to have that much money, and as we said, it could affect your millage renewal and stuff. What you can do for the kind of thing you're talking about is establish a separate capital fund balance. So then a capital fund balance is the same thing. It's a savings account, but the use is right in the name. So the members of your public know, okay, this is a capital fund balance. This is for a specific project. We know how our money is going to be used for the betterment of the library. This is going to be used for renovations, for an add-on to the building, and it's not just money that's just sitting there. So that's what we would recommend, is that you have a separate capital fund balance. Go ahead. You can say something, Shirley. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. That's exactly the way it should be. And public knows what it's for, why it's there, but you want to make sure that that's what it's going to be used for. You know, it's not a way to hide it. In other words, you want that another transparency that that's what that money is set aside for.
Okay, we are a couple minutes past 8, so I'm going to answer one more, and then the other couple questions I will write out and send them to you in your email that you will receive with the slides and the email, or I'm sorry, the link to the recording, so that y'all don't have to be up, so hang out here so long. Can libraries provide donation letters used for individual tax purposes and library self-fundraising? Yes. And if you like, I can provide you with a letter on State of Michigan letterhead that says you are tax exempt under this section of the Internal Revenue Code. So all you need to do is email me and ask for that letter. I do it all the time. I'd be happy to send you one. And then you could use that in your fundraising as well. One of the problems with that is right now, the way the taxes are set up is that in Michigan, donors can't deduct it from their taxes. And at the federal level, there's a personal, we all have that personal deduction of, it's like 25 grand. So unless you donate more than 25 grand a year, most people take that personal deduction instead of itemizing. And so a lot of people, don't do that anymore, but I know that there are circumstances when it's helpful, so you can absolutely do it. Example surveys and school board members or board members can absolutely attend MLA and ALA, and I think you would find it very enlightening and very, very interesting, and you get to meet board members from other libraries. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and I will send explanations, including of the question about the OMA and the remote access. I will lay that out and send that to you written out in the email. Thank you very much for sticking with me a couple of minutes past time. I appreciate that. And thank you so much for being board members. Thank you so much for coming tonight. We so appreciate that you take your time to train, because it's so important, and I'm very honored to have the opportunity to talk to you all. So thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of your night.